The night Emily Hartwell lost the biggest case of her career, the city didn't notice. Chicago kept moving. The elevated train rattled north along the tracks above Wabash Avenue. A food cart vendor on Adams Street was wrapping up his last sales of the evening, aluminum foil catching the amber glow of the streetlights. A couple walked past the glass tower on South Wacker, their breath briefly visible in the cold October air. They did not look up. Nobody looked up. Nobody looked up. On the 38th floor of Harrison & Cole, one of the 20 largest litigation firms in the United States, the conference room had emptied the way conference rooms empty after a verdict. Fast, quiet, and with a specific kind of careful that you learn after enough losses. Senior partners don't storm out. They gather their papers, button their jackets, and leave through the glass doors with the measured dignity of people who have trained themselves not to assign too much weight to any single outcome. They've seen this before. They'll see it again. Emily hadn't seen it before. Not like this. 2 years of work, 2 years of 7-day weeks and red-eye flights and depositions taken in airport conference rooms when she didn't have time to cross a city to do them properly. 2 years of a case that was supposed to define her career, and it had, just not in the direction she had sketched out on the whiteboard in her apartment at 29 years old, when she was still the kind of person who made 5-year plans and believed with the unexamined confidence of someone who had not yet encountered a real obstacle that plans and outcomes were the same thing. She sat alone in the conference room after everyone had left. She was 32 years old. She was 32 years old. She had spent 2 years building a case that a federal judge had called architecturally sound and structurally unsupported, the most expensive professional compliment she had ever received. She was sitting in a conference room from which everyone had left, in a building that was mostly dark in a city that was fully lit and entirely indifferent, and she did not yet know what the next 40 minutes would hold. The chairs were still warm. She didn't know it yet, but in approximately 40 minutes, a building service worker named Owen Marsh, a single father, a man she had never exchanged a single word with, would walk through the door with a mop cart, and before he left, set 3 words on her desk that would change the direction of her life. Not with wisdom, not with advice, not with anything she could have been given by any of the senior partners in their glass offices, or the mentors she had cultivated, or the careful, experienced people who had been watching out for her career. With a statement of fact made by someone who had learned it the hard way about the continued existence of tomorrow, the case had started with a photograph. Emily still remembered the afternoon it landed on her desk. A glossy 8x10 print, slid across from Marcus Webb, the senior partner who had recruited her out of Northwestern Law 3 years earlier. The photograph showed a loading dock at a warehouse facility outside Joliet, Illinois. Crates stacked floor to ceiling, a date stamp in the lower right corner slightly blurred as if someone had been in a hurry or had not expected anyone to look this closely, this many years later. Northbridge Holdings, Marcus had said, settling into the chair across from her with the comfortable authority of a man who had chosen which battles to fight and which to delegate for long enough that the choosing had become invisible to him. They've been classifying assets for at least 6 years. Our client is Delhi Logistics Group. They entered a $50 million joint venture with Northbridge that went south in ways that were not accidental. We believe fraud. We believe a deliberate conspiracy to obscure the true financial condition of the shared entity. We believe the paper trail is there, if someone is willing to dig for it. How much are we talking about in damages? Emily had asked. Total figure, including projected losses and punitive exposure, $200 million give or take. She had taken the case. Of course she had. She was 29 years old and had been at Harrison & Cole for 18 months and had not yet encountered a problem she could not solve by working harder than the person on the other side. This was not arrogance exactly. It was a hypothesis she had not yet had the occasion to test properly. The next 2 years were the most professionally intense of her life. There was, she would later admit, a particular kind of satisfaction in the architecture of complex litigation, the way you built it, piece by piece, deposition by deposition, exhibit by exhibit, until the whole structure stood on its own and you could walk through it and see how the pieces held together. Emily was methodical by nature, possessed of a quality that Marcus had described in her first performance review as prosecutorial patience, meaning she could wait out a reluctant witness for 3 hours without losing the thread or showing impatience. She had liked this about herself. She had relied on it. She had built a good case. She had built what she believed, in the final weeks before trial, was a genuinely excellent case, The federal judge had seen it differently. The ruling had come through at 4:47 on a Wednesday afternoon, 14 pages, single-spaced, written in the measured, occasionally almost kind language that federal judges use when they are declining to do what you have asked them to do. The court found the documentary evidence insufficient to establish intent. The expert testimony on damage is speculative and the plaintiff's theory of liability here. Emily had stopped and read the sentence twice, architecturally sound but structurally unsupported by the record. It was in its way a compliment. It was also a loss. Marcus had come to the conference room and told the assembled team that they had done everything right. He'd said it standing at the head of the table, jacket still on, choosing his words with the precision of a man who had delivered this speech in various forms with various adjustments for the particular contours of each failure many times before. The record here was genuinely difficult, he said. No one could have extracted more from what we had. Emily had nodded. She had said the appropriate things. She had waited until the last person filed out, and then she had sat down again in one of the black leather conference chairs, looked at the window and the city beyond it, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Nothing. Not grief, not the particular hot shame of professional failure, not even the specific anger she had sometimes allowed herself in private when she thought about how the case had gone, just an absence, a hollow where 2 years had been. She walked to the Mabel room because it was 2 blocks from the office, and because she was not ready to go home. The bar occupied the ground floor of a narrow 4-story building on West Monroe, and it had the honest, slightly worn quality of a place that had never tried to be fashionable and had consequently survived several waves of fashionable places opening and closing nearby. The bar stools were padded leather, cracked in a few places, repaired with mismatched stitching in a way that suggested someone had chosen to mend rather than replace. The bar top itself was dark oak, polished smooth by years of glasses and forearms, and the kind of casual conversation that people don't remember specifically, but which constitutes in aggregate the connective tissue of their lives. The bell, Eiding, was the color of late afternoon, even at 10 o'clock at night. Emily took a table near the window. She ordered club soda. She had thought about ordering something stronger, but she found when the moment came that she didn't want the blur. She wanted to sit with the thing clearly, whatever the thing was. She had spent 2 years learning to see clearly, and she was not ready to stop, even for an evening, even after a loss. She looked at her reflection in the window glass. Dark hair pulled back, dark jacket, a face she recognized as hers but didn't feel particularly connected to at the moment, a face doing its job in public, while the rest of her sorted through something in private. 32 years old, associate at a major litigation firm, technically still employed. Technically the architect of a case that the judge had described as architecturally sound, which was the most expensive professional compliment she had ever received. She pulled out her phone. No messages from Marcus, 3 from her mother which she would answer tomorrow when she had found the language. 1 from her college friend Diane, who lived in Columbus now, and who had a gift for saying the exact right thing in exactly the right amount of words. Thinking of you tonight, call when you're ready. Emily stared at that message for a long time. She didn't call. Not yet. She looked around the bar instead, a couple in the corner both occasionally showing each other their phones, 2 men at the bar itself, working through the end of their drinks, and a conversation that had the loosened, slightly repetitive quality of a conversation that had moved past its main point, but hadn't found its ending yet. A woman at a high top near the door, working through what appeared to be a contract. Red pen moving with the small, decisive strokes of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. And in the back, near the hall, to the restrooms, a man in a gray uniform was clearing and wiping tables. He worked at an even unhurried pace. Not fast, not slow. He turned the chairs up onto the table, surface, one at a time, wiped in even passes, turned them back down. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that had spent time either outdoors or in long vigilance. Not old, so much as experienced in a way that expressed itself in the set of the jaw and the economy of movement. Emily watched him for a moment. Then she looked back out the window. The street outside was wet from rain that had come through earlier. The light off the pavement was orange and fractured. A taxi moved slowly through the intersection and its reflection ran along the wet street like a second inverted city existing just below the visible one. Emily thought, I have been looking at outcomes for 2 years. I have not been looking at the street. She finished her club soda. She put cash on the table and left. Owen Marsh was 39 years old. and had been working building services in the loop for 11 years, which had given him a working knowledge of corporate Chicago that most of the people who occupied its towers did not possess and would not have known how to use if they had. He knew it the way furniture knows a room, by proximity, by long exposure to what people say and do when they don't think anyone is watching the man with the mop card. He had been doing the evening rotation at the Maple Room for 4 years, picking up the shift after his day job at the Meridian Tower on Michigan Avenue. The doubled hours made for long days. He was out of the house by 6:30 and rarely home before 11. But his daughter Cassidy was 12 now and needed things that cost money. Orthodontia, school supplies, the specific brand of sneakers that apparently constituted social survival. In 7th grade, Owen was not someone who spent energy scenting the costs of his daughter's life. She had gotten him through the first year after Claire, and if buying her the right sneakers was what the math required, then that was the math. His wife had died 4 years ago. Black ice on the Interstate 290 interchange in 90H in February. The kind of thing that happens in seconds and undoes the work of a decade. Owen did not talk about this at work. He did not have the kind of job where personal history came up. He showed up on time. He was thorough. He maintained the particular reliability that he had come to think of in the years since Claire as the most available form of dignity. Not heroism, not self-improvement, just showing up where he said he would and doing what he had said he would do. It turned out this was not a small thing. Tonight, working the back section of the Maple Room, he noticed the woman by the window. He had noticed people his entire adult life in a way that most people didn't. Claire had been a social worker and had given him over the years of their marriage an informal education in the way difficulty expressed itself in behavior. The small delays, the careful movements, the specific stillness of someone in the process of deciding whether to feel the thing they were feeling or to postpone it. The woman by the window had not ordered a drink. She was sitting with a glass of club soda and looking at a phone she was not quite reading. There was a quality to her stillness that he recognized, not grief, not exactly, because grief had its own phases and its own particular textures. This was something else. This was the stillness of someone who had been moving very fast for a very long time and had just been stopped by something external, and was now trying to figure out whether the momentum was still there, or whether it had been the thing doing the stopping all along. He recognized it because he'd had it. For about 6 months, this, after the accident. He had moved through his days with the careful, deliberate quality of someone navigating a space they were not certain would hold their weight. He had gone to work. He had fed his daughter. He had paid the bills and answered the phone and attended the school meetings and responded to the well-meaning texts from friends who did not quite know what to say, and so said things that were useful in their imprecision. "We're thinking of you. We're here. Just let us know." And all of this had constituted from the outside a life that was still operational, a person continuing to function. On the inside, something fundamental was trying to determine whether it still had a direction, or whether it had been the direction that was keeping it moving all along. That had been the worst part in the months after Claire, not the grief itself, which was large and present and in a terrible way, almost clarifying a thing you could point to and name. The worst part had been the operational question underneath the grief. What was he building and for whom? And was what he had been building before still the thing he was building? Or had it been something they were building together? And he simply hadn't known that until she was gone. He had gotten through it, not over it. He had become skeptical of the concept of getting over things, which seemed to him to describe a motion that left something behind rather than one that incorporated. He had gotten through it in the more literal sense. He had passed through and arrived somewhere that was not the same place he had started from. Carrying what he had learned, the woman by the window had finished her drink. She looked at the phone one more time. Then she put it in her jacket pocket and left without looking around. Owen watched her go. He went back to the tables. Emily had meant to go straight home. Instead, she found herself. And, back at the building, badging through the lobby with her access card, riding the elevator to 38, she told herself it was the file. There were documents she needed, practical considerations that didn't care about the emotional weight of the evening. The billing records she'd need to reconcile the yellow legal pad she'd been using for 6 months, which had accumulated in its margins a kind of informal diary of the case. Not her conclusions, but the questions she had asked herself along the way, the things she had noticed and not yet understood, the observations that hadn't fit anywhere in the formal structure of the litigation, but which had seemed worth preserving. The floor was dark except for the ambient glow of the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Emergency lighting in the corridors made the hallways look slightly cinematic. The way spaces look when they are built for people and the people have temporarily left. She could smell the floor cleaner, institutional citrus, the smell of a building being maintained. She sat down at her desk and turned on the small lamp. The Northbridge file was where she had left it. A 4-inch stack of paper bound with a thick rubber band annotated throughout in her precise, slightly left-leaning handwriting. The judge's ruling sat on top, visible through the rubber band. She looked at it for a long moment, and then put the whole stack in the desk drawer and closed the drawer with more care than the action required. She sat with her hands in her lap in the half-dark. Outside, the river caught the city lights and held them. A barge moved slowly westward, running lights blinking. The city was full and entirely indifferent, and she found when she let herself look at it without the overlay of everything else, genuinely beautiful. She had stopped seeing that. She wasn't sure when exactly. It was one of those things that happened gradually. And then all at once, the way the colder weather came. First a degree here, a degree there, and then one morning you walked outside and realized you had been bracing against cold for weeks without naming it. She heard the wheels of the cart before she saw the door open. The man knocked twice on the glass, even though it was already open, a reflex of courtesy, the habit of someone who understood that an open door didn't necessarily mean an invitation. "I can come back," he said. "Go ahead," Emily said. "I'm just sitting here." He came in and began emptying the wastebasket, working with the unhurried competence of someone who has done a thing enough times that the doing has become its own kind of thought. He was not intrusive. He did not try to fill the silence. He simply worked, and the working had a quality she found herself attending to without quite meaning to. After a moment, as he moved toward the window to clean the glass, he paused, not to look at the view, just to be still for one beat. Then he went back to work. Emily thought, he has been doing this for a long time, and he has not stopped being present in it. She gathered her jacket, picked up her bag, and left. She was almost to the elevator when she realized she'd forgotten the legal pad. Owen heard her come back, the soft footsteps, the hesitation at the door. He was in the senior partner's office down the hall, doing the windows, and through the glass partition, he could see her at the desk again. And he could see in the slant of the lamp light the expression on her face. He had seen it before, not on her, on himself, in the mirror, in the months after Claire died. The specific look of someone who had been building something for a long time and was standing in the rubble trying to determine if they were at an end or at a pause. He thought about what Claire had told him once late in the evenings after Cassidy had gone to sleep, when Claire would sometimes decompress by talking through the texture of her day. Not the case as the privacy of her clients was absolute, but the patterns, the recurring shapes of human difficulty. She had worked with families in crisis for 11 years and had developed a theory which she shared with Owen in the way she shared things she had earned through hard experience, that most people in real pain were not looking for solutions. They were looking for acknowledgement. The moment you try to fix it, she had said, you've communicated that what they're feeling is a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be seen, and the being seen part has to come first. Always first. "So what do?" Owen had asked. "You just let them know you noticed. You don't take it away. You don't explain it. You just make sure they're not alone in it." Owen had thought about this more since she died than he had during her life, which was the kind of terrible irony that he had learned eventually to hold without bitterness. You didn't always hear what someone was telling you until you needed it. He found a yellow sticky note in the pocket of his uniform. He kept them there for shift reminders, supply schedules, notes for the next rotation. He took out the pen he always kept clipped to the breast pocket. He thought for a moment. He was not a person who put a lot of words to things. He never had been. He was better at showing up than at explaining why, and the years of working quietly in buildings full of people who talked for a living had not changed this. What he had to offer was not articulate. It was just true. He wrote 3 words. He walked to her office and set the note on the edge of her legal pad. Not prominently, not in the center of the desk, on the edge, the way you leave something for someone that is meant to be found when they are ready, rather than presented when you decide. He did not wait. He picked up the cart and moved to the next room. Try again tomorrow. Emily almost missed it. She came in at 7 the next morning. She had slept poorly, the particular insomnia of the professionally undone. She had slept poorly, the particular insomnia of the professionally undone. The kind that doesn't keep you from falling asleep so much as it keeps waking you at strange hours to present you with thoughts you'd rather not have in daylight, let alone at 3 o'clock in the morning. She had made coffee. She had dressed in clothes that felt like armor or like a costume, or like both at once. She had taken the Red Line downtown because doing ordinary things in their ordinary sequence felt on a morning like this like the responsible choice. She was going to sort through the file, make a list of what needed to be formally closed, what could be archived, what her client would need from her in the practical aftermath of a loss. She was going to be professional about the professional failure because she was at her core a professional, and this was what professionals did. The yellow note was on the legal pad. She almost put the pad directly into her bag without looking at it, then stopped. Small yellow-blue ballpoint ink handwriting that was neither careful nor careless. The handwriting of someone who wrote things down, not to be read by anyone else, but because the writing itself served a purpose, functional, unself-conscious. She read it. Try again tomorrow. She looked around the empty office. No one. The floor was quiet at this hour. A few lights on in the partner's wing. The hum of the coffee machine somewhere down the hall. She turned the note over. Nothing on the back. He turned the note over. Nothing on the back. She stood there holding it for what she estimated later to be about 3 minutes. She was a person who processed information quickly and then acted on it. 3 minutes of standing still with a piece of paper was a long time for her, but the note didn't feel like encouragement, which was what she had been half expecting to feel, and then half expecting to resent. Encouragement had a quality of salesmanship to it, a brightness that often served the person offering it more than the person receiving it. This was something different. This felt like a statement of fact. Tomorrow exists. The day after a bad day is still a day. Whatever you believed ended yesterday did not take the next morning with it. Emily sat down. She put the note in the breast pocket of her jacket. She opened the desk drawer. She took out the Northbridge file. She began to read differently. That was the only way to describe the change. She had read this file hundreds of times over 2 years. Knew its structure the way she knew its structure, the way she knew the layout of her apartment, could locate any exhibit without looking, could reproduce the sequence of the argument from memory, but she had always read it with a specific and narrowing attention, the attention of someone constructing a case rather than investigating one. She had read it, looking for what supported the theory. She had read it, looking for the hole she needed to fill before the other side found it. She read it now, the way you read something after the outcome is settled. Honestly, she found the investment clause in Exhibit 31, page 4. It had always been there. She had flagged it early on, classified it, and then allowed it to recede in importance as the central fraud theory consumed more of her attention. It was a standard, appearing provision in the joint venture agreement governing the terms under which either party could seek additional equity participation in the shared entity. In the context of a fraud claim, it had seemed peripheral background, the kind of contractual boilerplate you noted and set aside because the foreground was demanding enough. She read it now more slowly. She read it the way she might read a contract provision for a client who had no case pending, a client who simply wanted to understand what they had agreed to. If Delhi had won the $200 million judgment, if the court had found exactly what Emily had argued, Northbridge would have been required to satisfy the judgment through a combination of cash and equity transfer. The equity transfer combined with the investment clause in Exhibit 31 would have given Northbridge a legal and contractual pathway to acquire controlling interest in Delhi's domestic operations within 3 years of any judgment. Not would have enabled, would have required. The clause was structured as a mandatory right of first refusal, triggered automatically by the specific equity movements that a $200 million settlement would have necessitated. In Emily read it 3 times. She got the settlement framework documents out of the lower drawer and laid them beside the joint venture agreement, and read the two in parallel, moving back and forth between them. The way you move between 2 maps of the same territory when you are trying to figure out where they disagree. They did not disagree. They were consistent with each other, in exactly the way that revealed the trap. The math was correct. She had not made an error. She set the documents down and looked at the window. What had happened, she understood now, was not that Northbridge had committed fraud, or not only that, not in the way she had argued, What had happened was that Northbridge had constructed a joint venture agreement that was designed from the beginning to end in one of two ways. Either Delhi would fail to bring suit and Northbridge would maintain the status quo, or Delhi would succeed in bringing suit and the equity mechanics of the settlement would handbridge the company. The fraud had not been in the financial classification, which was real, but was also in retrospect the visible layer intended to people. Layer intended to piety. Rofe litigation, the fraud had been in the contract itself. She sat back. The ruling had saved her client, not from losing a case, from winning one. She thought about the 2 years, the red-eye flights, the depositions in airport conference rooms, the hours spent building an argument that had been architecturally sound and structurally unsupported, as the judge had put it, in a sentence she had found devastatingly accurate. She thought about the yellow note. Try again tomorrow. Tomorrow was already different from yesterday. She spent the next 3 weeks building something different. She did it quietly, without announcement, without going to Marcus first. She pulled in Delhi's in-house counsel. Without going to Marcus first, she pulled in Delhi's in-house counsel, a careful, deliberate man named Robert Findlay, who had been skeptical of the fraud theory from the beginning and who listened to her presentation with the controlled, focused attention of someone trying very hard not to let his vindication show. So the settlement itself would have activated the investment clause. He said when she had finished laying out the documents automatically within the existing contract framework, within the existing contract framework, we would have handed them the legal mechanism to take majority control in year 3 using our own judgment as the instrument, and the loss means the clause was never triggered. Northbridge has no equity pathway. Delhi retains full operational control of its domestic infrastructure. Robert was quiet for a moment. What do we do now? He asked. Now we go on offense, Emily said. Not in litigation, in structure. She had been thinking about this for 2 weeks. Not an appeal. Appealing a judgment on these facts would have consumed another 18 months and produced at best the same outcome with different language. What she had in mind was different, a restructuring of the joint venture agreements themselves, introducing governance protections and equity provisions that would key the kind of creeping acquisition Northbridge had been positioning for structurally impossible rather than merely difficult. In parallel, she had identified 2 institutional investors who had expressed interest in Delhi's logistics infrastructure and whose investment at the level she projected would dilute Northbridge's existing stake to below any actionable threshold. It was not the work she had trained for. She had trained for courtrooms, for the focused adversarial logic of litigation, where the question and its answer were bounded by procedure and statute. This was something more open-ended. Deal architecture, governance, design, the kind of work that corporate lawyers did and that litigators sometimes looked down on, as if the real work of the law happened in trial rather than in the conference rooms where the structures that ended up in trials were built. But she had spent 2 years learning the interior of this company. She knew where the structural weaknesses were. She knew what Northbridge had been attempting to do with the joint venture, which meant she knew with unusual precision what needed to be made unreachable. She worked on it for 4 months. At the end of 4 months, Delhi Logistics closed a $40 million growth equity round with 2 institutional investors. The joint venture agreement was restructured to include independent board representation and revised governance provisions. 3 core contracts were renegotiated in a way that removed Northbridge's remaining leverage, without requiring further litigation and without crucially alerting Northbridge to the fact that the leverage was being removed. 6 months after the restructuring closed, Delhi's valuation crossed $500 million. Robert Findlay called Emily on a Thursday morning to tell her she was at her desk. The yellow note was taped to the frame of her desk lamp, where it had lived since the morning she'd read T. He filed differently. "I want to talk to you about joining the legal advisory panel," Robert said formally as standing counsel. "This work, it's not how we typically think about outside counsel, but it's how we should have been thinking about it all along." Emily thanked him. She hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of her office. Then she looked at the note. She had not forgotten where it had come from. The linen trees on West Monroe had gone gold again. It was the particular quality of October light in Chicago that Emily had noticed. This second October in a way she hadn't entirely before, or had noticed and not retained, the way you stop registering things you pass every day. The slant of the afternoon, the way the light came off the river at a lower angle now, making even ordinary buildings look like they had been given a second coat of something. The smell of the city before the cold fully took it, a combination of exhaust and lake wind, and something that was just Chicago, particular, and unrepeatable and unreachable from memory, available only by being there. She walked to the maple room after her 4 o'clock call. She'd been going occasionally over the past year, not as a habit, not regularly, but sometimes after a long day, she would walk the 2 blocks and sit for a while with coffee or club soda. And she would look at the street and think about nothing in particular, which was something she had not been very good at until recently. She had told herself at various points that she was not going in hopes of seeing the man who had left the note. She had told herself she still wasn't entirely certain it had been him. Both of these things were partially true. She ordered coffee, actual coffee in a white ceramic mug, and a shortbread cookie she ate. This time she took the window table. The bar was quiet at 5:30 on a weeknight. She saw him about 20 minutes later. And a gray uniform, same methodical attention, working through the back tables with the consistency of a person for whom the work itself was the point rather than a means to some other point. Emily watched him for a while. She understood sitting there, something she hadn't been able to quite formulate before, what she had recognized about him without knowing him, without any information beyond the way he moved, was the quality of his attention. He was completely present in what he was doing, not resigned to it, not enduring it, present in it. There was a difference. She had spent 2 years in one of the most visible litigation cases of her early career without ever quite being present in it. She had been there technically more than there physically in terms of hours logged, but her attention had always been angled toward the outcome, toward the structure she was building toward, and the actual present moment of the work had been largely instrumental, a means to an end she had in her mind already achieved. She had not been looking at the street. She stood up when he moved near enough. "Excuse me," she said. He stopped and looked at her. "I think you left something on my desk last year," she said. "In the Meridian, 38th floor. He looked at her carefully. "Yellow note," he said. "Yellow note," he nodded. A single unhurried nod. The nod of someone who had done a thing and was neither proud nor embarrassed about it, simply willing to own it. "I wasn't trying to be presumptuous," he said. "You just had the look." "What look?" He took a moment, like someone who'd been building something for a long time and just watched it go down and was trying to figure out if that was the end of the building, or just the end of that particular structure. Emily was quiet. "How did you know it wasn't the end?" "I didn't," he said. "I just knew it hadn't been for me." He didn't give her the full story that night. Yes, he had to get home. His daughter had been to the orthodontist and had spent 3 days eating only soft foods, and was apparently furious about it in a way that he found both difficult and privately wonderful, because fury was a form of engagement with the world, and engagement was what he had been working toward for 4 years. He mentioned this, and Emily laughed genuinely without the slight management she had learned to put on public expressions of amusement. It was the laugh of someone who had forgotten briefly to be careful. They had coffee a few weeks later on the Riverwalk. November, both of them in coats, the river doing its flat gray November thing. He told her about Claire, about the accident. He told her about Claire, about the accident, about Cassidy at 8 years old waking up the morning after the funeral and being outraged, genuinely and specifically outraged about the location of the cereal bowls, about how he had laughed and cried at the same time, which was something he hadn't known he was capable of until that moment. "That was your note," Emily said. "That was my note," he agreed. "Did anyone leave one for you?" He thought about this seriously in the way he thought about things, without deflection, without the conversational habit of answering quickly to seem easy to talk to. "Cassidy did," he said, "not on paper. But she told me, in the only way an 8-year-old can, that we were going to figure out the cereal bowls, and that was what I needed to hear." Emily held her coffee with both hands. "I went back and read the file differently," she said. "Because of the note, I found something I'd missed. Not a small thing. What kind of thing? The kind where losing the case was better for my client than winning it would have been." Owen raised his eyebrows very slightly. "That's a strange kind of luck," he said. "It wasn't luck," Emily said. "The information was always there. I just wasn't reading it from the right direction." He, though, that about this Claire used to say that. He said not about law, about her work. She said most problems look different when you stop trying to fix them and just try to understand them first. Emily nodded. The river moved past them, gray and purposeful. They finished their coffees. The yellow note lived in the frame of her desk lamp for the rest of that year and into the next. It was not a decoration. She had not framed it or laminated it or made it into the kind of object people put on their desks to signal to visitors what kind of person they were. It was taped there with a single piece of Scotch tape at one corner, barely visible unless you knew to look. And it said what it said. Try again tomorrow. She was a different kind of lawyer in the year that followed. Not softer, if anything, more precise. Not softer, if anything, more precise. Having spent 4 months doing work that required her to think structurally rather than adversarially, to see the full shape of a problem rather than the single point of entry she'd been trained to find. She was better at knowing what her clients were actually trying to protect rather than only what they said they wanted to win. These were not always the same thing. In her experience, they were rarely the same thing, and most of the failures she had watched over 3 years had come from treating them as if they were. She started taking lunch away from her desk 3 days a week. She called Diane more often, not just when there was something to report, but in the idle Tuesday evening way that people called each other when they were friends who had decided to stay friends despite everything. Diane, for her part, asked good questions and did not try to give the answers back. She had always been this way. Emily had not always been able to receive it. She noticed sometime in the winter following the restructuring that the view from the 38th floor was genuinely beautiful, not as a reward or a backdrop, but as a fact about where she was spending her days. This seemed obvious. It also seemed like something she had not known before, in the way that many obvious things remain unknown until the circumstances that were obscuring them are removed. She ran into Owen and his daughter Cassidy at a Saturday farmer's market on Green Street in the spring. She was buying tomatoes. They were standing at a honey display, with the focused intensity of people conducting research. Cassidy had assessed Emily with the frank directness of a 12-year-old who had learned early that being her father's primary companion meant evaluating new people carefully. "You're the lawyer," Cassidy said. "I am," Emily said. "Dad said you figured out that losing your case was actually winning it, more or less." Cassidy considered this with the expression of someone cataloging information. "That's a logic puzzle," she said. Then she turned back to the honey. Owen caught Emily's eye. She laughed, the same laugh as the orthodontist story, the same quality of something unguarded. It surprised her every time it happened. This laughter. She had been a private person for a long time, and private people develop a distance between themselves and their own responses that can become eventually a kind of loneliness. She had not noticed this about herself until it started gradually to change. Cassidy bought 2 jars of buckwheat honey and a jar of clover honey and explained on the walk back to the parking lot the specific flavor differences in terms that suggested she had been doing more research on the subject than was strictly necessary. Owen listened to all of it. He always listened to all of it. He always listened to all of it. There is a particular week in Chicago every autumn when the trees along the lakefront change all at once, the same annual transformation that happens everywhere. But here it happens against the water, Hag. Aced the particular gray-blue of Lake Michigan in the shoulder season, and the combination has a quality that is hard to describe without reaching for language that sounds approximate. Spectacular seems insufficient. Beautiful seems too general. It is more like evidence. Evidence that the world can hold both loss and continuation in the same frame, and that the continuation does not require the loss to have been meaningful, only accepted. Emily walked to work through Grant Park on a Tuesday morning in her second October, after everything. She was not the same person who had sat alone in a conference room 2 years earlier, watching the city with the hollow expression that a stranger at a bar had recognized from across a room. She was also not entirely different. She had learned in the interval to be skeptical of the idea of being transformed. It was a story that put difficulty in service of the narrative rather than acknowledging that most difficulty was just difficulty unchosen and not obligated to mean anything. What had happened was simpler than transformation. She had lost a case. She had read a note. She had read a file differently in the morning. The file had contained information she had been present for but not quite present with, and that information had opened a different kind of work, and the work had been good. That was all. It was also everything. She had a 9 o'clock with Robert Finley about Delhi's governance structure. She had a noon filing in a separate matter. A contract dispute between 2 mid-sized logistics companies that was unglamorous in all the ways that cases without 9-figure damage claims are unglamorous, and which required the same quality of attention as the Northbridge litigation had required. Because all work required the same attention if you were paying it correctly. She had spent 2 years learning this the hard way. She intended to keep it. She had stopped thinking of the Northbridge loss as the defining event of her career. It had been a bad day that had contained in the file she had finally read, without an agenda, the information she needed to do better work than the day had seemed to permit. A bad day, a note on a desk, a different reading in the morning. Everything that followed had been work demanding, and occasionally still difficult in the ways that made her wonder in honest moments whether she had gotten the fundamental questions right or only the secondary ones. She suspected she had gotten some wrong. She would continue to get some wrong. This seemed now like an acceptable condition, rather than an indictment. She was learning to prefer the honest uncertainty over the clean false certainty she had once mistaken for competence. She crossed Michigan Avenue and started up the last block toward the tower. Her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket. She didn't reach for it immediately. She looked up at the building instead. 40 some floors of glass holding a sky that was exactly the blue that Chicago skies are in early October. Not summer, not winter. A specific and temporary shade that would be gone by November. November. A specific and temporary shade that would be gone by November. That existed for a few weeks every year and nowhere else. And at no other time. The kind of thing you only saw if you looked up. She had stopped looking up somewhere in the 2 years she had spent looking at the case. She was not sure she could pinpoint exactly when it had been gradual and then complete. The way the narrowing of attention always was reasonable at every step, unreasonable in the aggregate. She looked up now. She thought about Cassidy explaining the flavor distinctions of honey varieties in a parking lot, with the focused thoroughness of someone who had decided that if a thing was worth knowing, it was worth knowing completely. She thought about Robert Finlay trying very hard not to look vindicated and achieving at best partial success. She thought about a November afternoon on the Riverwalk. 2 people in coats with their hands around paper coffee cups, a gray river doing its flat, purposeful, entirely indifferent thing, while they talked about what kept you moving when the thing that had been doing the moving was gone. She thought about a yellow sticky note, 3 words, the handwriting of someone who wrote to record the truth rather than to be read. The building entrance was in front of her. She pushed through the revolving door. Gerald at the security desk said good morning in the specific way he always said it, unhurried, present, the good morning of a person who had decided at some point that this was what he was going to bring to this lobby every morning he showed up, and had been bringing it ever since. Good morning, Gerald. Emily said she meant it the way you mean it when you understand, having lost it briefly, that ordinary mornings are not ordinary at all, but are simply the name we give to the days that arrive and ask nothing of us except to be present in them. This was a small thing. It was not small. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. The doors closed. 38th floor. Tomorrow.